Our roundtable discussion brings together industry leaders and experts to discuss key insights and lessons learnt since the new Building Safety Act came into effect. Key stakeholders in the construction and property management sector share their experiences of the Act's impact. We focus on understanding the challenges encountered, the solutions implemented, and the path forward to enhance building safety standards. Our assembled industry experts are at the forefront of adapting to the new safety regime. Their experiences and insights will provide valuable guidance on navigating the complexities of the new regulations so that you stay ahead in this evolving landscape.
So I think we'll launch straight in with the first question, which obviously this year has seen some significant milestones with the Building Safety Act. And I'd like to start with a question about how prepared we think the industry has been for the changes that have resulted. And perhaps, Sam, I could start with you on that question.
Yeah, I think it was a little bit of a shock when everything came in, or when everything was drafted in the end of August and then came in at the beginning of October. But I do think that the industry is getting there. A lot of the things that they've asked us to do are things that we, should have been doing already. It's just really about being a bit more prepared, being organised, and then making sure that you are ready to go in front of the regulator or building control to be looked at.
And do you think there were any details in the secondary legislation that perhaps caught the industry a bit more by surprise or off guard?
I think the application outside of higher risk buildings. I think people were prepared for higher risk buildings. There was a lot of publicity, but the depth that it goes to all buildings has been a little bit of a shock, because you still get people who have made the assumption that because they don't deal with resi, it's not really anything to do with them, and it really is.
Yeah. Chris, if I could perhaps just come to you with your thoughts on how prepared the industry was for the changes.
I don't think the industry was prepared for the changes, and it's caused upheaval, and it's had implications for everybody, from people sat around this table, from architects to contractors to the client. The duty holders, as the understanding within the industry is I still don't think is there. The industry, I agree with Sam, the industry is pivoting and it's adapting, but I still think there's a significant challenge.
And is that an understanding or a resource capability?
Both.
Yeah. Okay.
Both. I don't think that the wider the industry is understanding the implications. It's still working through it, and also we've seen in excess of 1,000 registered building inspectors leave the industry, and that has implications for all of industry.
And Gary, I wouldn't mind bringing in a sort of client's perspective to this. So perhaps just some feelings about how you prepared as an organisation for the Act coming in, and your take on your supply chain as to how it's responded, perhaps.
So from a social housing perspective, it's been very much head in the sand. And even now, people are still not recognising that this thing is upon us. In terms of design and construction, are probably the best prepared across the whole life cycle of a building within social housing. Post handover, not very prepared at all. So in terms of the supply chain, it's pretty good, even though it isn't as good as maybe they would like.
And the preparedness on sort of managing existing assets, is that a skills gap, or is it an awareness piece, or is it a mixture of the two?
So the big thing here is doing the day job correctly. And for years now, if you're talking legacy stock, the day job hasn't been done correctly. So in order to rectify that situation, is the housing industry, social housing industry, prepared for that? No.
Okay.
But they need to be.
Yeah. And has the Act sharpened the lens on putting some attention to getting the house in order?
My thinking is, from a social housing perspective, and we've got a question on this later, but social housing hasn't got a systems thinking view.
Okay.
everything is segregated, it's in silos, and therefore they don't look at the interdependencies across the entire life cycle of their stock, from new build through to disposal. So without that systems thinking, the Act is quite difficult to try and push within that social housing industry. Getting better.
And does the notion of a golden thread and that sort of simplicity of language, if not delivery approach, does that help sort of get everybody behind a systems thinking approach?
Another challenge within social housing is education. And Scott, we've had many conversations about the golden thread, The golden thread, people interpret the way they want to interpret what the golden thread is for them and for their organisation. The education of people as to what actually is the golden thread isn't there. Is that the fault of the Act? Is that the fault of the government? Is that the fault of the housing industry, the social housing part of that industry? I don't know. But the education around what it all means isn't there. And I get Dame Judith Hackett and Dayluck and people like that wanting the housing industry to take responsibility and accountability for all of this, and therefore not overly giving guidance. But I think we can work a bit closer together.
And David, perhaps on the training piece there, is any thoughts on that from a...
I was asked recently what has changed. I answered, everything's changed, but nothing's changed. Going back to the start of CDM, it was the enactment, the UK's enactment of European Directive 9257, and that was enacted under the 1974 Health and Safety at Work, etc. Act. The etc. is very important because that's an enabling act that makes all these regulatory things. So, looking at this progression, we've arrived at the Building Safety Act, and everybody, the industry, has, as you rightly say, and I don't think it's been prepared. They haven't realised. They thought this was a new thing coming into the industry. It's not. It's just a new way of doing what you... And didn't Dame Judith Hackett say, look, don't wait for guidance. You know what to do it. And so those words ring, don't they? So here we are. The enactment was in 2022. We're now in 2024, and industry is still waiting for guidance and still saying to the BSR, the regulator, the regulator isn't there to guide. The regulator is there to make sure that, so there's a big culture going, and you're absolutely right. Everyone's concentrating on the high-risk buildings, and they haven't realised that CDM, the Construction Design and Management Regulations, these higher levels are just higher levels of the existing regulations, and the PAS 8671, 2 and 3, they're just the frameworks of those higher levels that have got to be. And the culture change now is where everyone's looking for workarounds, but there aren't workarounds now because the workarounds are being closed up. Now, even the client, and I don't think the industry's even looked at this yet, the client declaration, come on, they're going to have to show how they got to appoint somebody that's competent. Do we actually know what good looks like at the moment? That's the next question, isn't it?
Yeah, and thank you for the question, because I think it probably is the next question that we should come to. Actually, is for me, there's a question of is it understanding the competency framework that is the bigger challenge, or is it the available resource that we have in our industry, and it's a skill shortage issue that I know we've spoken about. So for me, is it understanding the competency regime, or is it the skills themselves that's the issue? And Gary, perhaps I could just come back to you at that point, as you've sort of describe some of that. Do you have a view on, is it understanding or is it the actual skills and the number of people in the industry?
So from a competence point of view, from with a social housing head-on, we rely on the design, our supply chain in design and construction to fulfil that competency for our new builds. And I think that's what the question is around.
Yes.
Because we've, wrong word, but we've abdicated that because we don't need to think about that because that's with our supply chain. And that's not to say that we're ignoring it. And processes and ways of working are changing around. We are beginning to ask for that kind of competence.
Yeah.
It was at one point that, for instance, somebody goes around to do a repair. It's not one of our main repairs contractors. It's subbed out to somebody else. We don't know whether that repair's been done, let alone competence.
Yeah.
So that has all needs to change. But again, from an education perspective, social housing needs to understand the implications of all of that across their stock.
Yeah. And it's interesting you mentioned supply chain a couple of times now, and perhaps opportunity to bring Sunmay in terms of clearly you have quite a supply chain, I'm sure, as an organisation. I just wondered how you're dealing with competency assessments and your view on, is it a skill shortage or is it an understanding of competency?
I mean, competence check, we always been doing it in certain way. I think now it's more keeping the record of it and ask the right question to them, to each individual consultants and etc. supply chains. And that is we were doing it, but we be more formalizing it. And what is more challenging is qualified architect doesn't mean they know all the compliances. So that's a skill shortage that, knowledge shortage. And I was talking with Chris before as well, so how the architects will be really managing these compliance checks as a PDBR and all those kind of managing the golden thread information on behalf of us to delivering to us so that we can pass on to hand over to our client. And that is the biggest challenge because golden thread of information, we may think we are doing very robust, system, and we're doing all our best, keeping all the folders. But that is not just the golden thread of information. Among those information where the golden thread is, that is identifying it, how to keeping it when we hand over. And that is a big challenge. Although we know it, we are quite prepared. As Gary said, we are quite prepared in terms of delivering our product. And the next stage is a big challenge as well. But when we're delivering it, how competent we are, that is, until we're doing it, we don't know.
And documenting and proving it's probably an opportune moment to bring you in, Scott. Any thoughts on sort of any of these issues that you've heard?
Yeah, absolutely. Competency is a really interesting subject because there's lots of different parts of legislation out now. There's the PAS, there's the British standards, etc. But essentially, is there any one part of any of this legislation that is very clear on you are a competent architect, for instance, to work on this scheme because you have X in place or you have worked on at Y? So, for instance, by having your architectural qualifications in place, is that enough to suggest you can work on this high-risk building? If you've worked on a high-risk building previously, but this one happens to be of modular nature, are you competent because you've never worked on modular? There's lots of questions when you start going through it. So one thing that we've tried to do is develop a competency checklist, for instance, and try and help guide people through those questions, because that's the only thing we can do. Is, me personally, I've broken down the legislation to think, well, what is our customer asking about this legislation? What are they trying to figure out? And all we can do is trying to break those questions down into a step-by-step way of answering that question. But competency, once you go into it in finer detail, it's still quite a grey area for me.
Okay. And we've spoken about competency and skill shortages, and I know you've already mentioned that, Chris. Any further thoughts on sort of, is it is competency the sort of a too high a bar that we're setting for driving some of these skills challenges?
No, and we've been impacted upon this probably more so than any other parts of the construction industry, because all of our registered building inspectors have had to go through competency with CABE or total training, and now our RBIs have all got a classification in terms of what buildings that they can work upon. Yeah. You know, from class 2 to 3 complex buildings, class 4 technical manager, and I think that is going to happen across all disciplines within construction. And I think everyone will agree around this table that's the right thing to do.
Okay, so you sort of see yourself as the sort of thin end of the wedge that's coming for the rest of the industry?
I think that's absolutely what's going to happen. And there's parts of the legislation that we think is a good thing. And the gentleman brought up the Hackett review. We think this is a positive for our industry. So it means that the right people are surveying the buildings in the right way.
Yeah. At the right time.
At the right time, yeah. It's you know, it has, and I mentioned the word upheaval before. It has caused upheaval, but we think it's the right thing for construction.
If I might just add to that, if I may, in terms of the competency, providing, well, just looking at experience on some of the projects that we've been involved with, what we have seen is people putting too much information in place because of the grey areas. You know, when you read the legislation, it's predominantly based on the principal designer and the principal contractor. What are their competencies? You know, so from a client's perspective, the regulator wants to know from you, those particular parties. What we have seen is people submitting information about the entire design team and various subcontractors as well, the MEP contractors, etc. And they're almost making problems for themselves by going down that route. My advice is always keep it simple.
Yes. Right information at the right time in the right place.
Yeah. Is that an education thing, Scott?
Exactly, yeah.
So the next question I'd like to move on to is just some of the challenges around the Building Safety Act and the regime. And I think we've spoken about skill shortages, certainly. For construction projects, I suspect gateways are possibly some challenges that the industry's facing up to. I'd just like to explore thoughts on what the biggest challenges are that you're seeing and perhaps some of the solutions that you're seeing. So, again, if I could perhaps bring in the contractor's viewpoint first on May, if there's any particular challenges, what do you think the biggest challenges you're facing with the Act are?
I think we talk quite a lot about it, actually, carrying out competence check and then also delivering the golden thread of information. And these are the two biggest challenges, especially personally for me, because I'm the design management and dealing with the consultants and etc. So in that chain, challenge is continued so far, but the industry is very new in a sense to delivering it through the gateway. So that is the biggest challenge at the moment.
Yeah.
Yeah, and architecture role will be the most evolving in duration of this experience, the Building Safety Act. How their role is going to be, not just the lead designer, but also checking the compliance as a PDBR. Are they going to do it? Some part, like RIBA, do ask for it, but sometimes there's conflict of interest as well. When they're designing their own building, they need to check the compliances. So there's a lot of different variety of the architect's role will be happening, I think.
And do you think your supply chain and designers have quite understood each of the gateways and some of the challenges of getting through them?
I think they do quite understood the last 2 years, but how we're going to actually doing it and delivering it, that's something questionable at the moment. I mean, Golden Thread of Information is a good example. We've been doing it for last many decades, and in terms of filing systems and etc. But when you say golden thread, yeah, we know it's this information, important information set to hand over to client, but that's not everything. Document controlling is everything. There's a lot of digital twins and all those kind of things need to come together as a collaboratively. And how are we going to deliver this? No one answers. So that is one of the reasons I approached the Operance as well. So we need to try and see how it's going to be, but as all we can do best. As Chris said, it is the right direction for the industry, I think. I do believe, yeah.
Yes, thank you. And Sam, thoughts on the biggest challenges of the Act and any solutions that you've seen?
So I definitely think information management. and I also take on board the post-occupation, and that's all about information management. I think there are still some uncertainties. For example, how much it's going to cost to go through a gateway. That is still unclear in terms of the charges, how long it's going to take, because it's the industry, you know, the regulator hasn't really been tested yet in terms of new builds. I think there's been a couple, and I think that they are taking a while to get through. So I think some of those uncertainties, I think really the solution is to go in with your eyes open. I think prepare for the worst and hope for the best in terms of delays and cost.
Yeah. And Chris, any thoughts on gateways particularly, I guess?
Answer the first question. We've discussed it a couple of times around skill shortages, especially in building control. And quite rightly, the market is fixing that in terms of our RBIs now, quite rightly, are demanding better packages and they're being paid correctly. So that's sort of getting fixed, but we still need to make building control an attractive sector to join. And secondly, because I do see it on the coalface around clients, the information to clients and the requirements now of a client, and someone mentioned before about the declaration, you know, understanding how important that is. We're heavily involved in supporting clients through the gateways, and the industry has pivoted towards BRPD, and we are providing consultancy to ensure that clients meet the requirements and for the submission of gateway. To echo Sam's point, we don't quite know how that looks in terms of the submissions and the acceptances of that. That's I think we'll find out more about what that looks like over the next 12 months and what how the regulator responds to those gateway submissions.
And perhaps, David, any thoughts on sort of the biggest challenge of the Act?
Biggest challenge, we're involved with an organisation called Future.Now. There are elephants in the room. One of the big elephants is that we have to do it, the industry, the construction industry, has to do it digitally. 58% of the industry, all industry, is digitally illiterate in 2 of the 20 basic digital skills. Now, when we're talking about building safety case and safety case reports, we're not talking about basic digital skills. We're talking about fairly high-level digital skills, you know? So over this next year, I think the elephants, the grey rhinos and the gorillas are going to abound here because, you know, the actual regulator is going through all of this sort of stuff. And they will, you know, they haven't said how you've got to do it digitally. They've said you've got to do it digitally. Mm. So the industry has got to find its way around here. So we have some big problems to overcome on this because over this next year or so, the industry is going to find out what it's all mean. And that's why I'm asking what does good look like, you know, in terms of digital and things like that. So this is a big problem that we're going to have to look at. And of course now with the building regulations and the changes and the principal designer building regulations, so it's now a criminal offence to operate incompetently. So, you know, where it was before the behaviours, you ought to, they said the behaviour is knowing when you're incompetent to not accept a thing, you know? And of course we saw it in the inquiry, didn't we? Well, they admitted it. An incompetent architect waved the card and said, this card gives me competence, it's a competence card, I took the job, I hadn't done that before, and we know the consequences. It's those sort of issues now that we've got to really, and employer, you're saying the employer's statement, how you got to that point. We haven't really tested across the industry what good looks like and doing it digitally. And
I think if I could move the question on a bit into the digital space, and Scott, come back to you probably for that. So there's a skill shortages around digital as well, possibly, is what I heard clearly from you. But for me, Scott, do you see a digital solution as an enabler of the cultural shift, or is it just an enabler of the whole process?
I think essentially any digital platform is just a tool. It still comes down to that cultural shift. I personally think the biggest challenge is resource at the end of the day. From what I've seen, you take the larger organisations, more resources available. So we're seeing them be more proactive, putting the digital platforms in place and the training, etc. However, I've seen, going back to your original question, what are the biggest challenges and what are some of the ways around it? I did see one really good example actually of an SME contractor with quite a small construction team struggling to really understand what it all meant for them. They brought in their local building regulations consultant to come in and give some training, some CPD sessions over a course of so many weeks. And I asked, how much did that set you back? That would have been a bit of a kick. And they said, actually, no, we negotiated it would be free, because for the building consultant, as well, the building regulations consultant, it's actually teaching them. So they're having to put all their research in place to make sure they fully understand it in order to teach it. It's that old saying, if you can teach it, you're learning yourself at the same time. I think that's just a really good example of how to get around that as well.
Collaboration, isn't it?
Correct. Yeah, absolutely.
And so there's a sort of skills challenge that might be different, and you've described how that might be different for larger contractors as opposed to SMEs. Again, Sunmi, do you see difference in your supply chain of preparedness?
Yeah, so some of the smaller consultants don't have rapid models capacity of it, and we have to discard them from the list, which is quite pity, because they've been working with us several years and etc. And yes, so, it does happen. And small subcontractors also don't have those kind of systems, so they need to subcontracting it. Somebody can provide digitally.
So it's possibly compounding your sort of resource challenge anyway, if you've got a dwindling.
In general, whole supply chain. But I would like to add one thing in the golden thread of information is very closely linked with the competencies, because BSR is not. Many people are apparently asking, when I went to BSR conference, they're asking, oh, do we have all the information? What is the list of information we need to submitting it? And BSR say, don't ask me. You ask yourself that you think it's enough. That is what it is. So it needs really competence of main contractor and who relying on the consultant to make sure they're delivering it. So it is all about competence.
You make a really good point there. I've spoken about that a lot, actually. You've got a really fine balance. The BSR, they have this saying of be curious. Be more curious about your buildings. And therefore, you tell us what information you've got and what information you should have in place, which I think is brilliant on one hand. It really makes the clients think about what information they've got and the quality of that information as well. However, the BSR will also tell you, we don't want reams and reams of information.
Exactly.
That will cost you lots, because we've got to charge you per hour to go through all that. So it's a real finite balance, and I don't think we're going to find that balance for a while yet until it's been put into practice.
And Gary, do you feel like you typically suffer from lack of information or too much information that you can't get to the right bits of information?
That word. Okay. So from an information point of view, one post-gateway into the throwing it over the fence regime, information, to your point just, Scott, is sadly lacking. Fundamentally, when you think of why we're sitting around this table, and that is the Building Safety Act as a result of Grenfell, we still, as an industry, do not know what's in our buildings. I find that fundamentally, it's gobsmacking. Why do we not know what's in our buildings? So when you ask me about information, and I need to keep this brief, I understand that. Information is very important, but sadly lacking.
And that's presumably existing assets principally that's driving that conversation, or do you see it with new assets as well?
So legacy, definitely. New build, now we have the capability, and we can ask for the capability from contractors for all of the data that we require for the entire life cycle of the building to maintain that building and know what's in there. So that our safety cases and safety case reports, although they're stories about the buildings, our stock, behind the stories, we know that the story is correct.
Yes. Yeah. And do you suffer with too much information on newer buildings because there's concern of giving you everything of an asset? Okay.
No. But the one big thing for me, and people call me Mr. This, and that is COBE information. So a COBE data set gives you everything you need. It's not perfect, but it's a starting point for everything you need to understand and to manage your buildings. The problem comes, where do we put that data? Many instances I've been through, many people say, we can do that for you, and they provide you with a CDE. We need the data.
I think partly the problem with Kirby data, generally speaking, is the design teams are asked to provide Kirby data, and it becomes a chore because they generally don't. Certainly, going back a while, they'd never priced for that type of thing. Now, to add that on top of their service, that's just a bit of an annoyance to them. I think the biggest problem there is, again, the education, because they don't actually know what it's used for. The Kirby data is incredibly useful if done correctly, because we're going to use it for this. They don't get to see that end user's perspective. Correct. So therefore, it's just a box ticking exercise where it's just a bit of a chore for them.
And that's why I mentioned previously about systems thinking and understanding that by providing this data downstream, a call centre rep can pick up the phone and understand that Mrs. Smith on the 4th floor in flat 22 has got a smoke alarm in the hallway. Whereas currently it's who's Mrs. Smith, not quite that bad, but...
Yes. And the challenge around your legacy sort of estate then, that sounds like a real challenge in terms of resourcing, be it people or...
But we have regimes, we have inspection regimes, we have all kinds of different things where we have to go to the buildings and we have to do certain things. So we can get some of this information. And one of the other challenges, Sam, you mentioned, cost. We can get the information as standard for a little more cost. The legacy buildings, point clouds, digital twins, there's ways and means of being able to do it, but again, it goes back to the other challenges we've been talking about, and that's operational, that's all sorts. But the big thing here is operational costs, procurement costs, contract costs, resource costs, great. There's a big systems cost because we've got nowhere to put it at the moment.
Yeah. And that probably leads us into a question around cultural shift as well. So I think culture and culture of the industry has probably come through some of the conversations already. I just wondered, do you think the industry is responding to the Act with ticking a compliance box or really responding to that cultural shift? I wondered if anybody got any thoughts or good examples of some cultural change. Perhaps, Sam, I don't know if I could come to you first.
I would love to say that we're having a cultural change. We I think all in this room have all said that this is what we need. We all accept that this is what we need, and those like myself that have worked in compliance and health and safety for nearly 20 years, it's always what we've needed. I think there are some areas that are still trying to find, I think you said it, the workaround, and that's not the ethos of what this is about. This is about us, I suppose, holding that mirror up to ourselves as an industry and recognising what we needed to do. I think we've mentioned silos before. People run off and try and fix it their way. I think we can do it. Yeah. I think we need slightly longer than was anticipated to do it. I've seen good things and I'm still seeing resistance, but, with people like us, hopefully, working through it, that we will get there.
Any other thoughts on cultural change?
Yeah, one of the things I've seen experienced throughout various different roles within industry is insurance, actually. is that cultural shift is not just, oh, well, how's the contractor going to manage this? How's the architect going to manage it, client, etc. It actually goes far beyond that. So insurance, solicitors, etc., their take on the regulations has actually had a huge impact. So hence why you see these silos and people trying to shift the risk to others because they've been driven down one path by their solicitors or their insurers, etc. And I think we've got to be really mindful of that cultural shift being far wider spread than we believe. And things like that Gateway 2 to Gateway 3 period, whereby design teams pulling together the golden thread of information. Well, actually, who's taking responsibility for that information during that period? And culturally, I've not seen anyone take the lead on that to say, we will, as a client, for instance, as the principal accountable person, at the end of the day, we've got to submit that information. So if that information is submitted at Gateway 3 and actually it comes back and the BSR have got some queries and questions and that building doesn't get occupied by X, who's then culturally going to take the responsibility for that? You know, every part of this process, there's going to be small little cultural shifts all along the way.
And collaboration is, as you say, a sort of key sort of risk or sort of facilitator of it.
I'm coming to one of the points now that you make in the sense of, is there a difference between cultural change and the legislation? So I love legislation. I like reading it. I like how it is. So yeah, the last 9 months has been okay. But so I read the legislation, and if I was just looking at it as it says, the client is responsible for the golden thread, albeit they can ask others to assist. Now, what I have noticed is that the industry is finding solutions and people are taking charge, and contractors and architects. I'm concerned by that, not in the sense that we don't need the solutions, just that people still understand their responsibilities, and legal responsibility can't be delegated. So for me, I think we will find a solution, because that's the whole point of a construction industry, to find solutions. But I do think education of everybody involved, understanding how far their responsibility goes, is vital when we're doing that. So it goes back to the silo thing as well. Don't come up with a solution on your own. Make sure everybody understands.
And anything on culture from a client's perspective that you'd like to come in with?
The antithesis of culture, if I can, and not being negative, but so the way I've seen this in 4 or 5 HAs, and the example I'm going to give is building safety in HAs, all of them I've been involved in, is a project. Now, building safety, as we all know around this table, is a way of life. That's the mind shift we've got to get to, and that's we've said it many times. The silo piece. Oh, well, we throw it over the fence. I don't care what happens then. Well, everybody, we're all interdependent here. So soapbox away.
The biggest change then is the collaborative culture of it's not
because building safety is not a project.
I just wanted to add on the cultural change. So one of the biggest cultural change for the main contractor is early engagement. Because of the Gateway 2, until that approval, you cannot start on site. Before we could start on site and we can develop the stage 4B with our specialist once we sign the contract and etc. Now we have to do it during the PCSA when we're developing it, and we're normally doing only market testing and see the value of it, and then we value engineering later. But that all has to come front, and how we're going to, only with the PCSA contract, how we're going to procure those specialists at early point. That is a big culture change,
And are you seeing clients respond to that sort of change.
We need to educate our client to understand the situation and how we can manage this going forward. And we haven't gone through that process yet, and that is now this challenge this year that we have to see how we manage.
Yeah, and I think for me it comes back to sort of time and resource, doesn't it? So it will impact.
Yeah. Also, sometimes people pushing back, like client, it's their duty to appoint the PDBR, but they ask us to do it, and that all we need to learn how we're going to manage.
That is one of the benefits, positives that we're seeing early in the enactment of the Act.
Yeah.
We are being consulted early on a BRPD perspective by contractors, by architects.
Yeah.
I think that's a real positive for the industry.
So it's dragged delivery into the sort of earlier design set of how things are going to be built.
Yes.
I would actually add to that as well. From a contractor background, I would always argue for getting the contractor in as early as possible. Especially now with the Gateway 2, how much information is sufficient information. We always used to talk about these oven-ready projects back in the day. Wouldn't it be nice to get to site and having all your design ready? It was a really noble idea. Everybody would love that, but in reality, it just doesn't exist, and it probably never will. Even with modular schemes and everything else, that's just not the industry we're in. So it's very difficult. So getting the contractor in, yes, absolutely, as early as possible, is really key, especially if it's that Gateway 2 period. However, being on the development side as well, getting the end users involved as early as possible is really key. Exactly. Because going back to your point earlier, the information, let's not forget, has to be kept up to date throughout that whole life cycle. So the format that information is provided in is really key to form at the very beginning.
That's completely mindset change,
Exactly.
Some people, especially development team or development company, say, we just deliver the planning and we do later. Yeah. That's not going to happen. I mean, it might happen, but it will be dragging your project into risk,
Yeah, right. Yeah. So again, that's the cultural shift of seeing a project not as a project, but as a sort of small part of the overall life of an asset.
I think industry has got to realise now that this cultural shift, what we're going through now, I'd liken it to, say, the car. Everyone understands the car. The MOT. One day a year, you take it in, you get an MOT. You've got another 364 days, if my maths are correct, where the driver has got to drive that vehicle safely, and that MOT certificate might be some sort of indication on day one, but through the year until you get to the next point that you've got to give all that proof of what you've done, how you've maintained and how you've driven, it's your span that you've got to do it, you've got to drive through the gateways, and we haven't got to the gateways yet. What's going to happen then? The costs are going to be, when and you're saying, what is sufficient to get through the gateway? I'm being asked on that. Is there? Can you, as an institute, can you guide us? Can you give us a model of what information we need for the gateways? We don't know. Yeah. We don't know what we're engaging with the regulator. We were at the conference. We're also engaging with John Vanstone, the chair of the Industry Competence Committee. What this is, we don't know. Until they assess this thing, and then you're going to get this knockback. And then, if you need to go back, isn't there a 12-week delay situation? Right.
Job easier.
Okay. Extra time is going to be problems, loss and expense, and all these things. The contractual situation. We talked about the insurance. We're currently doing some work digitally to provide brokers, insurers, and reinsurers with a live window, because that's a contractual relationship with a competent person. The reinsurers are saying that we only know years down the line when somebody puts in a claim, and we've got to then put a loss adjuster on that to look at was that person. So we're looking at quite an interesting bit of work now to give insurers, brokers, and reinsurers a live window on a digital competency framework so that they can actually see through a dashboard, red, amber and green, you know, you're in the green if you're probably an architect or a designer all the time, probably over the next 10 years, just doing the same work that you're always doing, you're going to be in the green. But supposing all of a sudden a plum job comes along and you say, hey, I'm not quite competent to that, but we're working it, but hey, look at the fees. So you take that. The dashboard in that situation will through the algorithms, will flag up that maybe there's an amber or a red even situation where the insurer at that point or the broker can get on the phone and say, hang on, you've got a contract, you signed this to say you were going to do it. The insurers have actually done this. Yeah, we're all right there, but you might need to fill the gaps on that competence. And this might cost you a little bit more in premium. But do it then during the lifespan of the contract of the insurance, rather than do it as a claim years down the line.
Could I just touch on the MOT analogy?
Yeah.
I think the MOT analogy is excellent for this conversation because an MOT, generally speaking, is on that day we tested your car, it is safe.
Yes.
What happens for the other 364 days is up to you.
Yeah.
You are duty bound to keep that car as safe as possible, and it's the same now with the building assessment certificate, isn't it? Is beyond occupation, every 5 years we're going to check, and that certificate is the same thing. Yeah. You are duty bound to keep that information up to date and that building safe throughout the rest of those 5 years. We could come and check that at any point, so be warned type thing. Again, it comes back to culture, isn't it? And making sure that information is correct and up to date. Yeah, it's a really good analogy. I like that.
As we've sort of drawn towards the end of our allotted time, I wouldn't mind just coming around to each of you and if you could just perhaps try and sum up in one sentence, if at all possible. I think we've heard some of the challenges and some of the solutions, but I'd like to sort of just hear your thoughts on the outcomes that you hope that the Building Safety Act will bring for industry. Scott, I'll start with you, if that's all right.
Yeah, I mean, it's easy for me to relay that our company vision is to manage the world's building information to make buildings safer. It's really simple. And we hope this Act will do that. By doing it digitally, it will help upskill people and it will help that information actually be of use. Because whether we think we've got enough information about buildings or not, there is information there about every building that exists on the planet. It may be a small amount, it may be a large amount, but actually what use is it? That's where the key benefit of this Act now, I think, will really help make sure that information is quality, is accessible, and will actually be used for good.
Which is probably a great segue into Gary, maybe, but the positive outcomes that you hope the Act will deliver for industry.
It goes back to my first point, really, and that is around the interdependency we all have. Now, that fits into culture, that fits into all sorts of things. Education, again. I want that Act to be in people's hearts, and if not their hearts, their minds at least. The implication of that Act is to change the way we think. I hope the Act does that.
Thank you. David?
Yes, I'm optimistic for the future. And I build on the past. One of my hopes for the future is to break down the silos. About 2 decades ago, I used to sit at the CIC with a different hat on, representing local authority. I'm now chair of London and South East Committee. Hopefully, we're going to have this going forward, breaking silos around that table. Hopefully, some of you will join my invitation eventually. It's going to come round to join that table. We've got to do it, optimistic. Break the silos, get together, combine. That's a good word, isn't it? Combine. And we'll find what good looks like.
Thank you.
Thank you.
So May?
So I think being a main contractor, one of the duty holder, and I think this is very positive, in terms of for the industry, and hope no blame culture. And to bring that is collaboration. I think the three duty holders should be really, really collaborate, especially now when we are beginning of the journey to learn each other. We cannot do it hiding behind the desk, We need to talk together and agree it and find a strategy way through. Then in a few years' time, we will be all quite competent, and confident, yeah.
Great, thank you. Chris, thoughts?
Yeah, probably two or three things I would say. Fundamentally, our team of registered building inspectors want buildings and regulations to be taken more seriously, and we're starting to see the Act do that. That's for sure. Selfishly for our team, I want the role of the registered building inspector to be taken much more seriously, and I think the Act is starting to do that. And Sunmay said before is that RBIs or BRPD, and from a consultancy perspective, is being brought in much earlier on projects. And I met with an architect at the start of the year, and they said what the Act is doing is bringing building control and architects closer together, what they were doing 30 years ago. So they would sit with their drawings and the approved documents and work through, and that's what the Act has done or is doing. So safer buildings for our clients, and the role of building control to be taken much more seriously, and we're starting to see that, and our team to be rewarded, and the industry to be much more attractive than maybe what it's been for the last few years, and again we're starting to see that fix.
Great, thank you. And Sam, the positive outcomes that you hope will come from the Building Safety Act?
Well, definitely everything that everybody else has said. Collaboration, safer buildings. Same as you, I would like those that have been responsible for compliance and always believed in compliance and saw the value in it to be seen as someone that should be at the table and not just seen as a tick box, because it does add value. Maybe take it a step further and recognise that CDM has been there for years, and that always considered use and maintenance of a building. I would like to also say that, one of the positives is without safety, you can't have quality. So it's a win-win. We get a safe building and we get a quality building. So for me, that I think is one of the big positives.
Thank you. So I think for me, it's probably just time to wrap up and thank each of you for participating. I think there's some key themes that have certainly come through for me, and it was nice that we ended on a bunch of stuff around collaboration. So I've certainly found it a collaboration of discussion of ideas, and thank you for each of your insights from your part of the industry. It's been great to hear them. So thank you very much for joining us, and I look forward to continuing the discussion.
Thank you.